Hello, learners, and welcome to the 28th lecture in this NPTEL course on 20th century poetry. I have introduced the figure of T.S. Eliot, and I have described some of his critical writings in a fair amount of detail. I have tried to establish how T.S. Eliot's presence is like a shadow that looms across 20th century writing, and in fact, most modern writing and thinking about poetry. I will now talk a little bit about a set of poems that Eliot wrote late in his career. They are a little bit less studied, although they are no less famous. And Eliot's influence is such that almost every work of poetry and prose that T.S. Eliot wrote has been studied to a great deal. Nonetheless, the work that we will focus on has received slightly less attention than some of his canonical work. He is most well known for poems such as The Wasteland and The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. But here we will be focusing on the work titled Four Quartets. Before I get into it, I want to talk a little bit about something that the scholar Edward Said defined with the phrase late style. Late style refers to the changes that come in the work of a highly accomplished, a highly senior and sophisticated artist as they reach the later halves or the ending stages or the last stages of their careers and their lives. So basically what Said is saying is that as artists and writers grow older, as they come towards the ends of their physical lives, but also towards the ends of their careers, we can see that their style changes. This is something that Said calls late style. For Said, late style is a shift from matters of experimentation, from trying to demonstrate one's own brilliance as an artist. All these things become less important as the artists grow older, and they start reflecting on simpler matters like what is the meaning of life and what remains. Partly this is a consequence of these artists and human beings reflecting on their own mortality, but partly this is also a stylistic change. Stylistically, Edward Said argues that artists move towards a simpler style, from daring and from producing formally complex arrangements earlier. Artists produce simpler arrangements as they age. Now we can see some of this change happening in the work of T.S. Eliot. There's a very key difference between the early and late Eliot. Early Eliot found a great deal of value in isolated mental activity, whereas the later Eliot replaced this emphasis with something else, and this was the sustaining role of community and religion. We can see this in the poems that would become published and become well known as Four Quartets. Four Quartets is more about the sustaining role of religion and less about the individuality of the poet who seeks to internalize, assimilate, and contribute to the mind of Europe. The mind of Europe, as I've explained in the previous lectures, refers to a particular relationship that T.S. Eliot as a poet tried to advocate between the individual poet and the history of writing and culture in Europe. This relationship was a relationship in which individual poets read, studied, internalized everything that poets had written before them, especially European poets, and especially European poets in the classical languages and cultures, that is, Greek, Roman, and other European languages like French, Italian, and so on. For Eliot, it was important for any young poet to first master and internalize the mind of Europe, and then they could contribute to that tradition of writing. In four quartets, however, we see that it is less about what the individual poet does as a brilliant practitioner and reader of the history of European literature. That is less important. What is more important is the relationship between the individual and the community in which he exists. The community, in Eliot's case, was often a religious community. So, what was this religious community, and why did Eliot come to write about it in four quartets? So, Eliot has spoken more about four quartets than he has about The Wasteland. The Wasteland was a poem that established this young man on the cultural map of Europe. Four quartets were written by a senior man, a much older, mature, and weary poet. I've used the word weary blues, which is the title of Langston Hughes's collection, to describe a state of mind, a structure of feeling. We can use the word weary to describe the stage in which T.S. Eliot was in his life as an individual human being and also as a poet at the time that he began writing four quartets. He had been going through a difficult marriage, and it would eventually come to an end. The marriage was difficult for several reasons. Vivian Haywood and T.S. Eliot married after a short whirlwind romance, but they were emotionally incompatible with each other. Vivian Haywood began to undertake a series of extramarital relationships, and one of them was with a close friend of the couple, Bertrand Russell. And soon after that, Vivian Haywood also began to develop serious medical conditions. Vivian Haywood was very disabled and was very sick for most of her life. And her sickness took a toll because Eliot spent much of his life being a caregiver. But this was not a role that he took to very happily. In fact, he began to grow quite bitter from this responsibility of caregiving, combined as it was with knowledge of his emotional distance from Vivian Haywood. Nonetheless, the duties of caregiving and the knowledge that Vivian Haywood was growing quite distant from him produced a deep mental strain on the poet and made his way into his poetry. A deep sadness and a somewhat bitter and remorseful. Eliot was at a difficult stage emotionally and professionally. And in addition to these personal difficulties, there were also some national and global difficulties that Eliot was dealing with at the time. And he speaks about these difficulties and the context in which he wrote four quartets in an interview in the year 1959 that he gave to the journal and the literary magazine, the Paris Review. And this is an interview series titled The Art of Poetry. Eliot speaks, "In 1939, if there hadn't been a war, I would probably have tried to write another play. The form of the quartets fitted in very nicely to the conditions under which I was writing, or could write at all. I could write them in sections, and I didn't have to have quite the same continuity. It didn't matter if a day or two elapsed when I did not write, as they frequently did while I did war jobs." I'll explain what these war jobs were, but some facts are important to note. Four quartets were composed in a 7-year period between 1935 and 1942. The first poem in the series of 4 poems, which is titled Burnt Norton, grew out of some lines that were actually rejected, which didn't make it to the final draft of a closet drama that Eliot had written, which was Murder in the Cathedral. This was when war was imminent in Europe, and so it was difficult to stage plays. And Eliot's point here is that if the war hadn't broken out, and if theaters were active, and if it was possible to stage plays, he might have written plays. And if he had continued to write more plays, he would not have written this meditative, reflective, spiritual, and very philosophical poem. So it was, in a way, the quarantine-like conditions produced by the Second World War for non-combatants, for civilians like Eliot, that became the perfect condition for him to write this long poem. The composition of this poem was shaped by unforeseen historical forces, whose providential qualities later became part of the poet's subject matter. This is an important thought. So while the war broke out, it caused untold, unspeakable, unprecedented human suffering. The poet began to turn this into his subject. As the war broke out and as he began to write a poem, he began to reflect on suffering, on war, on human agency, human beings doing things to each other which caused untold suffering. This became the subject of the poem. Of course, Eliot turns a deeply philosophical and religious gaze on this very material and tangible acts of human suffering. So, Eliot got ideas for this long poem with a visit to a particular location. So what began with a chance visit to the old country estate at Burnt Norton, it grew into Eliot's spiritual autobiography. And that's exactly what this poem is. It is Eliot's spiritual autobiography. It describes his ancestral life in England, that is in East Coker. It describes the emigration of his parents' generation from England to America, that is their emigration to Massachusetts. And finally, it describes his own migratory journey, the trip across the pond as an American to England, and finally his embrace of the political and cultural identity of England by his acceptance and by his admission and by his ordainment into the Church of England. This is the story that Four Quartets tells, but it is not a factual narrative. It is a spiritual autobiography. It describes the ideas, the feelings implied by these movements and these admissions. Layered with this factual narrative are echoes of Eliot's earlier poems, as well as intermingled strata of philosophy and theology. So Eliot was a deeply scholarly poet, and we see the scholarship reflected in a different, simpler style, in a style that is more accessible on the surface, at least more accessible than his earlier poems, but is equally complex and challenging in other ways. This is what I mean when I use the word late style. So to return to the quote, Eliot said that he was able to write this poem, or the writing he did during the war turned into this poem instead of turning into a play, because he could work and he could write in an interrupted fashion. He could write poems between phases of interruption, interruption caused by his responsibilities, by his having to do what he calls were war jobs. War jobs included volunteer work as an air raid warden. Twice a week, he stayed up through the night, walking the roof of the Faber and Faber building in Russell Square, London, while German bombers menaced the city. So he tried to spot an air raid before it began and tried to give warning and alert others. So he was doing this volunteer war job duty as a civilian, trying to do his bit during the Battle of Britain. So this poem, Four Quartets, is also deeply connected to space. And it's important to note the connection or the relationship between places and this poem. So the titles of the four parts of the poem refer to four places. And it seems easy to conclude that this is a poem about places. But that is not the case. In fact, it's a bit misleading. So what are these titles and what places do they refer to? Burnt Norton, the title of the first poem, refers to a country estate located in the town of Chipping Campden in Gloucestershire, England, which Eliot visited in the summer of 1934 with a close American friend, Emily Hale. Eliot came to East Coker, the second poem, the title of the second poem, a village in Somerset, in August 1937. It was from East Coker that his ancestor Andrew Eliot sailed for New England around 1669. The dry salvages are 2 or 3 knobs. Now, the dry salvages is the title of the third poem. The dry salvages are 2 or 3 knobs of rock just off Pigeon Cove, a few miles north of the fishing town of Gloucester on Cape Ann in Massachusetts. And now we are reading about a location that's across the pond, across the Atlantic Ocean in America. In this location, Cape Ann in Massachusetts, the Eliot family, now we're the Eliot family, which is a very, very elite, established business family in St. Louis, Missouri, which is where they owned businesses, but they also had an ancestral home in Massachusetts. This family owned a summer house near the harbor in Gloucestershire, and the young poet used to sail on the dry salvages on his one-man outings along the coast. So the New England area, and especially the coast of New England, which is in the northeast of the United States, is an extremely cold and difficult place. But because of these reasons, it is extremely pleasant in the summertime. So elite business families or people who could afford to often owned houses, summer vacation homes along the coast of New England. And it was in this coastal Massachusetts that the Eliot family owned a summer house. And here, as a young man, Eliot used to sail by the dry salvages on his one-man outings along the coast. So different stages in the Eliot family history, that is what the titles of these 3 parts of this poem refer to. East Coker, Burnt Norton, and the dry salvages. Now we come to the 4th poem, which is titled Little Gidding. Little Gidding is in the village of Cambridgeshire, and it is home to a chapel where a small Anglican religious community founded in 1625 by Nicholas Ferrar gave refuge to King Charles I during the English Civil War. Why is this important? This is important because T.S. Eliot famously declared that he became extremely conservative in the second half of his life. He declared that he was an Anglo-Saxon in terms of ethnicity. He was an Anglo-Catholic in terms of religion, and he believed in the monarchy. So the history of Catholicism in England is a deeply political and controversial one. But to summarize briefly, the older Catholics in England were persecuted by Protestants, and the monarchs, because of their Catholic faith, were exiled, were forced to leave. So the fact that Eliot aligns himself with this small group, with a small Anglican religious community, it is signaling not only the religion that Eliot embraced, which was the Church of England. The Church of England was a small resistant group. The Church of England was the shape that Catholicism took in England in order to survive after the onslaughts of Protestantism. So Eliot's alignment with Little Gidding in Cambridgeshire is an alignment not only with the Anglican Church, but also alignment with the monarchy, the hierarchical political and class structure of England. This was also an extremely conservative thing to do, and Eliot was signaling to his readers how important the sense of a community was. This was the community that sustained Eliot, the community of monarchical, religious, Anglican people. Now, we have established how the titles of the four parts of the poems in four quartets refer to places that have an important role to play in the spiritual family history of T.S. Eliot, and also the professional and spiritual development of T.S. Eliot as an individual poet, as a young American who moved to England after college, who began to write poetry, who won the approval of a deeply conservative literary and cultural establishment, and who embraced with gratitude and a great deal of belonging the conservatism and the hierarchies, religious and cultural, of England late in life. These places are key locations in that narrative. However, the poem is not understood or cannot be understood simply by reference to these places and what role they play in the narrative of T.S. Eliot's development. The historical facts or the material details of these places do not really take us very far in terms of interpreting these poems. And why is that? That's because these poems are not so much about the places as the reflection on language and history that is triggered by the poet's remembrance or observation of the place. It may be useful to compare Four Quartets as a poem with other poems in the English literary tradition, which are also about places. And there is a tradition of the country house poem. Some famous examples of the country house poem are Samuel Johnson's To Penshurst and Andrew Marvell's Upon Appleton House. These are famous poems, and as is William Wordsworth's poem Tintern Abbey. These are all poems about family houses, which are also deeply connected to Christianity. They're also about churches and places that signify the passage of time, places which contain memorials to people who have died. And through these reflections, through poems about places that signify both religious communities but also rural communities in England, poets have tried to achieve something. In that tradition also, T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets can be found to be an outlier. Why is that? That is because in all these poems, from Johnson to Wordsworth, the richness of time and place anchors the poet in the world. The poets and the speakers of these poems have a very strong connection to not just the names of the places, but also the physical and spiritual realities of those places. That is missing in Four Quartets. Eliot is not writing from a place where he is securely grounded. So this is the key thing to note about Four Quartets. Four Quartets uses the names of four places as the title of its four constituent poems. However, the speaker of these poems is not grounded in these places. In fact, the poems are more about intellectual and spiritual reflections that are triggered by the memory or simply the names of these places. Now, even the memory is not a strong basis or a strong foundation for these poems, because T.S. Eliot himself had not known these places very well through personal visits. Eliot seems to have visited East Coker and Little Gidding only once. His places in the world are real, but they hold their main significance as points of departure. So these titles refer less to actual places, and they refer more to spiritual states and states of consciousness. Burnt Norton, to take the example of the first place, the title of the first poem, Burnt Norton takes its name from a terrible fire that occurred in the 1740s, destroying a country house of which no trace remains. Only in the name of the estate, not in the actual place itself, is the historical memory of the fire preserved. And the poem Four Quartets, of which the first section is Burnt Norton, begins with a reflection on a burnt out, non existent, invisible rose garden. The poet describes the rose garden from different temporal perspectives. The poet describes the rose garden from the perspective of the ghosts of the garden itself and birds that have witnessed the garden having existed once, having burnt out, and of seeing people walk around in that space, reflecting on both the past, the present, and the future of the garden. The titles of these sections illustrate the idea, an idea that Eliot had expressed earlier, which is that every poem is an epitaph. What is an epitaph? Worth reflecting on at this point. An epitaph is a short text, often inscribed on tombstone, that commemorates a deceased person. It can be a few words, a phrase, or a short poem, and it typically summarizes the person's life, personality, or accomplishments. So that is what an epitaph is. And for Eliot, describing a theory of poetry, every poem is an epitaph because every poem refers to something that is irretrievable. So just like a person who is dead is no longer exists, and the relationship between the language on the tombstone and the life that has ceased is one of longing, but also one of displacement. The words on tombstones displace something, because whether or not they're accurate, there's no way of knowing. And in a way, they are the reality of the person who is no longer alive to challenge, disprove, or clarify exactly what the words are describing. So similarly, a poem also displaces reality which is lost forever. One can understand T.S. Eliot's poetic theory contained in that message as saying something like this: because of time, every poem is an epitaph, every place is ghostly, and every poet is a ghost. History and poetry save the meaning from oblivion only through the unifying pattern that faith supplies. A final thought before I conclude this lecture and continue the discussion in the next one is the importance of religion. At one point, Eliot is supposed to have said, I cannot in practice wholly separate my poetic appreciation from my personal beliefs. Religion was so important to Eliot that it is difficult to overstate this claim. And religion is an even more important personal belief of Eliot's, which is important for this poem, because it was written after Eliot's conversion and his ordainment to the Church of England. Now, what mattered most intensely to Eliot before his conversion was his experience of art. And this is a shift that I was talking about earlier when I said, what is the late style in Four Quartets? The essay, The Tradition and the Individual Talent, which I've discussed at great length earlier, as well as the essay on the metaphysical poets. All of these writings help us understand how the experience of art was the most intense experience for T.S. Eliot before his conversion. That changed, and changed terribly, one might say, quoting W.B. Yeats's poem, Easter 1916. What changed completely, it changed utterly after Eliot's conversion and his ordainment to the Church of England, was that what mattered most intensely to Eliot after his conversion was his experience of religion. However, it is not that religion replaced art, or that religion took the place of an artistic, craft. No, that is not the case. Something stays constant even though religion replaces art. What stays constant is that throughout both halves of his career, experience for T.S. Eliot has no physical, egotistical center. Its fragmentary quality bespeaks a mind that knows reality, not through action, but through the flux of language. This is the thought with which I will end this lecture, and I will ask you all to keep this in mind. The flux of language. This is what's more important for Eliot, whether he's talking about the importance of art or the importance of religion. The flux of language, the escape from emotion, these key ideas which have become so important for T.S. Eliot and for our view of T.S. Eliot's ideas of poetry. It is not that his ideas change, but they take a different form. And if we can see the connection in both these stages in Eliot's life and career, we will find it very useful and practical to interpret his poem, The Four Quartets, which I will read and discuss in great detail in the next lecture. Thank you.